I have a deep hunger for comic book podcasts. Welcome to Dear Watchers, an omniversal comic book podcast where we do a deep dive into the multiverse.
We are traveling with you through the stories and the worlds that make up the omniverse of fictional realities we all love. And your watchers on this journey are me, Cyborg Guido, resurrected yet again.
And me, Rob, devourer of worlds. And before we begin our little trip through the multiverse, Guido, what's new in our little section of the omniverse?
Well, we've had a great response to our last two episodes on DC Imaginary Stories, including one of today's featured characters. We joked last time that we weren't becoming a DC podcast, so we're slowly transitioning away from that with today's episode. We're trying to blend them together.
Superman podcast, really.
I guess that's kind of true. But go listen to our last two episodes if you haven't already.
And that's
they
Jimmy
were lots
Olsen
of fun.
and Lois Lane.
Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane. So of course Superman shows up, and Fantastic Four, the trailer came out just a few days before recording this.
It did?
So it's definitely relevant here and to what we're doing today.
Didn't it have something like the most views of anything in a certain amount of time?
I stay away from that kind of news. I stay away from all news. I stay away from that kind of news too. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure if it broke records, and I guess we'll talk about our opinion of it in our third segment, but that's not our focus for today.
Well, if you're joining us for the first time on our Superman podcast, multiversal podcast, we have three parts of our journey through the multiverse today: origins of the story, exploring multiversity, and pondering possibilities. So thanks for coming along.
And remember, leave us a 5-star review wherever you're listening, and find us on Blue Sky and Instagram at Dear Watchers.
And with that, welcome to episode 153, and let's check out what's happening in the Omniverse with our travels to today's alternate universe. Today, we are asking the multiversal question, what if Superman and the Fantastic Four teamed up against Galactus?
And we could have asked so many more questions for this world, and we'll get into that. We have covered Superman and the Fantastic Four countless times at this point. I didn't even bother.
Our very first episode covered the Fantastic Four because it was what if #1, what if Spider-Man joined the Fantastic Four?
Yeah, well, I guess this is kind of like what if Superman joined the Fantastic Four? Maybe we should have made that the question.
What if anyone wearing a red and blue suit joined the Fantastic Four? And then Captain America's next.
And we have covered some of the Marvel DC crossover books via amalgam, but otherwise we have not gone there.
Oh my gosh.
In 553 episode, we have not covered. I think for a long time at the beginning, I was like, well, we want to build up the way of being and dive into some of the more hidden corners and do some of the core in each of the separate universes before we cross over too much. We have done amalgams quite a few times, but we have not done some of the major crossovers, and that is shocking. We did guest on Comic Book Keepers to talk about Uncanny X-Men Teen Titans, but we have not covered it.
And in fact, you pointed out that the omnibus with this very story is literally sitting right behind my head as we speak.
Back on episode 97, I will point you there, we did give a history of the Marvel DC crossovers because we did a fun What the parody issue that had the Justice League and the Avengers fighting. So you can go hear our history of the crossovers. As for the world that we visit today, it actually is Earth 616 and the DC New Earth, which is the prime Earth at the canon. This was written to be canonical. We can talk more about that alongside DC versus Marvel, which we have not covered and one day need to. So let's assume the story is not truly canonical, but it was written as such, even to the point of taking in all current continuity, all the looks and locations at the time that it was written in 1999. But we're going to pretend it's an alternate Earth, and we're going to call it Earth Super Fantastic.
I love it. And of course, you mentioned the Fantastic Four, you mentioned Superman, but really the star of this issue and the star of the issues we're going to discuss today is Galactus. He's going to be a big part of the new Fantastic Four movie. So what is your background, Guido, with the character of Galactus?
I don't think I care, I think is the answer. Though every time I read more, I'm okay, I'm into it. I like cosmic existentialism,
Mm-hmm.
and Galactus definitely opens the door to cosmic existentialism, but I don't like outer space stuff. I don't like world devouring stuff on such a massive scale. And so I've never been a big fan.
Mm-hmm.
I obviously know a ton of Galactus. Obviously, from our regular listeners know, I've read primarily Marvel for most of my life, so he's always there. I know who he is. I know all of his various origin iterations. I know about the heralds. I know all those kinds of details, but I've never been a fan, I'd say. I'm not
Mm-hmm.
particularly interested. I have I have read the issues that we read today before, and I can talk about my thoughts on them when we get into them. What about you for Galactus overall?
Well, like you, definitely was super familiar with the character, probably first from the Fantastic Four animated series from the 90s. I think that was probably the first time I knew the character. And people who have listened to this show before will know I'm a big villain fan, but I was never a big fan of Galactus, and the reason is because he's not really a true villain. I
Well,
never
he has no
really,
personality.
yeah, no personality, but then also he doesn't want to be devouring the worlds, and maybe
Right.
we'll
Oh,
talk more
that's
about
true.
that.
Okay.
But those villains that were like the Sandman in Spider-Man or Man-Bat in Batman, like I never really liked those villains who like couldn't help but be villains, like they
Reluctant
wanted
villains.
reluctant villains. Like I don't know, it just never really fully did it for me. I liked a Doctor Doom, someone who's out there to be truly villainous. So I just never really latched on to Galactus. And I think, secondly, like you said, like he doesn't have a ton of personality. Those other big, larger than life, world devouring villains like a Thanos or something has so much personality to him, and Galactus just really doesn't.
So let's dive in and see if that holds true on our reading of his origin.
I'm hungry. I want an appetizer. So let's go into origins of the story.
Right now, on this very show, you're going to get the answer to all your questions. Our amazing story begins a few years ago.
And today on Origins of the Story, we have 3 issues to discuss. That is Fantastic Four, Volume 1, issues number 48, 49, and 50 from Marvel Comics. These are from March, April, and May 1966, and they're entitled The Coming of Galactus. If This Be Doomsday, which doesn't have Doctor Doom in it.
It's
kind
also
of a
very
fake out there.
Shakespearean,
It
the
is.
title.
It is.
I
It
don't
is.
get it. I sort of love it and don't get it.
Doomsday, later a Superman villain.
I thought of that
tie in
already
there.
earlier. Yeah.
And the last one is The Startling Saga of the Silver Surfer. Very Stan Lee title right there.
So all 3 of these are written by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, doing the art / story plotting, as we know. Inked by Joe Sinnott. Colors probably by Stan Goldberg, lettered by Artie Simic or Sam Rosen on the various issues, and Stan is the editor at this point. We read these 3 issues because they are the first appearance of Galactus, and it is a 3-issue arc, as you will.
Mm-hmm. And the first appearances of the Silver Surfer, who kind of goes hand in hand a lot with Galactus.
Correct. As does Uatu, who shows
yes,
up here.
Yes.
Our icon.
But he had
Uatu.
Appeared earlier.
He had
in
appeared
the Fantastic Four.
on a handful of occasions, actually. So this is your first reading. Did you probably actually, other than Fantastic Four origin issue, I guess we read Doom's first appearance.
Yes, we did.
We read Uatu's first appearance. But you probably haven't read much of this era. So any initial thoughts just about this arc, or what Stan and Jack are doing before we get into Galactus? Any general impressions?
Well, I think also after covering so much Silver Age silliness in our last 2 issues, what struck me so much with the arc here over these 3 issues is how contemporary, I would say it feels. And I
Yes.
think there's
I
certainly
agree.
things you could pull out as being dated in terms of the language and the art style and things like that. But just the way that it arcs over these three issues, like I can see a movie being this as well, or a modern comic. Like it just feels so modern. We introduce the Silver Surfer in the first issue, we introduce Galactus, we get the kind of core battle there, and then we get the denouement in the third issue, and kind of also setting up whatever story comes next. Feels very modern.
Well, I think what's wild, I had started a rereading with Elliot of Fantastic Four from the beginning, and I probably got to like the 70s and lapsed, and I need to go back. This era, I couldn't believe how narratively structured it was, like you're saying, in such a modern way. Even in terms, people always joke or say that it's a soap opera. X-Men's a soap opera too. But what I was struck by is while we read these three issues, like you have to read at the beginning the end of the previous fight with Black Bolt. Like every single issue leads into the next. And it's so unusual because most comics at that point are single issue, truly single issue, with the rare occasional continuation, but they're meant to be single issue episodes. Or you have the more modern age of comics now where they're arcs. You have a very clearly defined arc. And Fantastic Four is just serialized storytelling. It just doesn't stop. You can start and you need to keep going. Even in the third issue, there's like those little scenes where we had to even look up what they're hinting at. You're meeting a new character. You're getting foreshadowing of a villain who's coming. You're getting Johnny's first experience in college, which introduces Wyatt Wingfoot. Like, you just need to keep reading. There's not a start and end. In this case, there's the start and end of Galactus's attempt to devour Earth, but the structure is so interesting and I think unique, which is part of why Marvel was so distinct at the time.
And I think something that X-Men would probably really take and run with it, but you see it here as well, is a big thing I think that plays into that storytelling and into the soap opera aspect is kind of the male-female dynamics throughout all the three issues, because all of our characters have kind of their female counterpart or male counterpart. So you've got Johnny, who's kind of lusting after Crystal, who's now been from the Inhumans, and she's been separated from him. You have kind of Reed, who's kind of keeping Sue at bay, and Sue wants to be more involved, and Reed being kind of really being a jerk.
Silver Age jerky guys, we know Superman was one, but Reed is too.
And then really the core here is you have the Alicia character, who's the one who's really able to turn the Silver Surfer against Galactus, but in the end also Ben feels like that he's been abandoned by Alicia and that she's now more favoring the Silver Surfer, and that right there especially has this real soap opera element.
Yeah, it's all very character driven, and again, I just think the deconstructed nature of these, decompressed story nature of these stories, I should say. So now the story itself, the Galactus aspect. Did you enjoy getting to know Galactus? This is your first reading, yes?
I think I have read this before.
Oh.
But I think kind of going back to what we were just saying, I think the one thing that kind of lacks a bit with Galactus as a character, and I think also the Silver Surfer, at least at this point, is that they speak very robotically, also maybe like in that Shakespearean way, but not in an exciting
and
like,
voluminously.
Yes,
we have so much text. It is definitely the long-winded era of Stan here, because even I was surprised how many text bubbles were filling panels. That maybe was a strategy just for Jack to be able to work faster. I have no idea, but there were some panels where like 2/3 of the panel is covered in speech bubbles.
Yes.
It seemed very unusual to me, and you can definitely skim because, yeah, it's old Stan and his way of speaking that are unique there.
Well, and plotting and story too. There's a lot that eventually is relied upon in terms of these Deus Ex Machina kind of things.
Like the Ultimate Nullifier?
Yes, exactly.
But the Ultimate Nullifier is so important in the Marvel Universe. This is the introduction of it. And what's cool, so I guess we should give a quick summary of the story for people who haven't read this. Very easy to summarize. Galactus's herald, Silver Surfer, comes to Earth, which indicates Galactus is coming to feed off a planet. Uatu is familiar with Galactus needing to feed off planets, gets involved, breaks his Watcher's oath, of course, by getting involved. That will later be dealt with. And so all of this is playing out. Uatu guides Johnny to another universe or sort of parallel dimension to get the ultimate nullifier, a weapon that will threaten Galactus. Meanwhile, as you said, Alicia, her compassion, if you will, inspires Silver Surfer to turn against Galactus, try to get him to stop. But it is the ultimate nullifier that Johnny gets, which is a weapon that can, I guess, nullify, right? So cease existence, because otherwise you can't beat Galactus. And having that weapon causes Galactus to say, okay, I'll give up, I'll move on if you give me the weapon. And they agree. And
this tiny little gun, you know what it reminded me of? Do you remember in Men in Black, Agent K has the big gun, and then he gives Will Smith like the noisy cricket, and it's like this little tiny thing, but it turns out to be like this super powerful weapon. Like that's what it reminded me of, because the ultimate nullifier, like you think it's going to be big giant thing, it's like a little handheld silver thing.
Yeah. So that is the story. So yes, there's lots of convenient turns there. I think I think there's two things.
Not the character.
No, not the character. There's not two of them. I think there are two things about this story that really stand out to me. One is Galactus's design. It's quintessential Kirby with unnecessary flair.
Yes.
In a fun way, and looks sort of futuristic and ancient at the same time, looks like it's from another planet or from an ancient Earth civilization, like does that really perfect sci-fi blending that he does of those things.
And Stan Goldberg changed his mind between issues 48 and 49, because the first issue, he's very Christmas. He's red and green.
Then they get some purple in there.
Yes.
Yeah, but he doesn't still yet become purple and blue as we know him today at that point. The second thing that I think it does really well is that cosmic existentialism. And of course, the Silver Surfer drives most of that. Galactus at this point doesn't seem to care, and that's fine. In later stories, I think you get more of his character. But in this one, it's Silver Surfer who starts to care. And the conversations with Alicia, I love. I think those are some of the moments, and I can see why in 1966 people reading these were like, oh wow, because she's convincing him of humanity's worthiness, and he's really struck by the things she's saying and what he's seeing. And so it's a trope, a sci-fi trope for sure, like get the aliens to go away by showing them how strong and capable we are. But
you and I we've talked about this on the podcast before, but we've only really become Doctor Who fans in the last couple of years, and I could totally see that this was maybe impactful to later Doctor Who, because you also have so much of that there on the one thing that is able to ultimately save Earth is the humanity of humans, and that's something that the Doctor talks about all the time as well, is like the power of humanity, and that's what really changes the Silver Surfer's mind here.
Yeah, so I think those ingredients make it really fun, even if it's at times a slog to read, and even if it is like very convenient. I think the existentialism mixed with the visuals make it really fun.
Yeah, and I think the two things that really stood out for me whenever I read this early Fantastic Four in general is the character of the Thing. I mean, I think he's so fun, and you could just tell that for all kind of the pontificating that Stan might have done with other characters, he really loved Ben Grimm as a character. Like you can see he gives
Jack,
so much. Oh, Jack. And Jack too.
Remember that they're plotting the story together. So,
but the dialogue too, I think like the dialogue of Ben just jumps out as being so fun. And then I think like Jack's contributions throughout, there's so many panels where suddenly, especially with Uatu, he just does like a close up on Uatu's eyes, and it's got like just suddenly it's a wash in color. It's just green or red or something like that.
Well, or the greatest thing here, which he
Oh,
uses a
yes.
few times, which is the collage.
Mm-hmm.
He uses it in Fantastic Four on a few occasions, and it's so cool.
And it's actual real photos, right? That
Yeah,
are
and they're done like half-tones, so they look like newsprint, so they sort of blend in. This is now when Johnny's being shunted to the other universe. You get to see that, and it's just so cool. It is very acid trip like. Like you can just see the. I don't think Stan or Jack were using psychedelics, but you can see the influence of psychedelia on that kind of imagery, and it's very cool to see. So, yeah, a fun read, a fun intro to the character. Definitely pieces I think we'll see in the movie, which we can talk about later before we wrap up.
Well, they're clearing the table and they're bringing in the entree. It's time for exploring multiversity.
I am your guide through these vast new realities. Follow me and ponder the question, what if?
And today we are asking the question, what if Superman and the Fantastic Four teamed up against Galactus? This is from Superman/Fantastic Four #1 from Marvel and DC, though it is published by DC. This is from April 1999, and it's entitled The Infinite Destruction.
It's written by Dan Jurgens, who also does the art with the help of Art Thibert, who does the inks and finishes some of the penciling with Dan. It's colored by Gregory Wright, lettered by Bill Oakley, and of course has an unforgettable cover of Alex Ross working with Dan. In terms of history of this, Dan Jurgens, by the way, for those who are not familiar, was the iconic 90s Superman writer, killed and resurrected Superman, had a huge long run on the title. So you can see why he was the natural person to write this. In terms of this, the history of this release, remember that we had Marvel and DC crossovers starting from the 70s, and they were not so much of a thing really until 95's DC versus Marvel. And so 94 to maybe 97, you get a bunch of one-shot crossovers, Batman and Punisher, Superman and Silver Surfer, actually. Some set in the world where the characters met, the world of DC versus Marvel, and others not. This was kind of a pair of releases in 99 with Hulk Superman. It was a prestige, oversized Treasury edition, and it is the last one except Batman Daredevil in 2000 and the JLA Avengers in 2003. Those are the final Marvel DC crossovers, so we're in the tail end of their ability to work together. And it was actually, though, just republished in the Marvel DC Omnibus Volume 1 that Rob mentioned we have multiple copies of, and they reprinted it in the first volume, which is just the crossovers. The second volume's the amalgams. So let's talk about this issue. Overall impressions first?
Overall impressions is it's kind of, I thought, a jumbly mess. I thought it just, like, the story just kind of was a little all over the place. It kind of felt thrown together. I actually had to go back and reread a few times thinking, oh, did I miss a page? Because I was reading it digitally, and I was like, no, I didn't miss a page. It just feels very cluttered there.
I feel the same way.
Mm-hmm.
My guess is for some reason it's being rushed. I'm not sure why that is. And I also think it got cut at some point. Now, it might never have been drawn, but there are so many weird gaps in the story.
Yes.
And it probably could have been nearly twice the length. Certainly it could have been 25% longer. I think it's something like 40 or 50 pages. They surely had a cap, just cost-wise, publishing-wise, but it could have had another 10, 15 pages easy, because there is so much stuff that doesn't make a whole lot of sense or get fleshed out. So here's a quick summary for people who haven't read this book. So there is a device that has been sent to Superman's world. So the actual DC world. Remember, this is written to be canonical. And the device, it turns out, is a device that Galactus, many, many, many years earlier, when he detected Superman being sent from Krypton. So we're to believe in this, that Galactus is an omniversal being, which makes a whole lot of sense.
Yes.
He sure would be. Detects him, sends a tracker so that he can sort of come back to this powerful being of Superman. Meanwhile, Superman gets a crystal that tells him a story that Galactus is in fact the being that destroyed Krypton. This motivates Superman to go back to Earth 616, the Marvel universe. Now again, in this world, Superman has already been there and already met the Fantastic Four. So in this world, DC versus Marvel happened. This is meant to be our world. They know each other. They know of each other's existence. In fact, when we meet Franklin Richards, he's playing with a Superman toy and watching a Superman cartoon.
Yeah, like Superman is a cartoon.
But they know he exists in another world.
Yeah, yeah.
So anyway, long story short, Superman gets to 616 only to be turned into Galactus's herald. And then the, I guess, true villain of the series appears, which is Hank Henshaw, the cyborg Superman, who we all know from the Death and Return of Superman, who becomes a villain at that point and is killed.
He was kind of following Galactus because he basically wanted to tap into like Galactus's like ultimate power.
Right.
Basically.
So it turns out he forged the crystal that told Superman the story that Galactus had destroyed Krypton. That is not true. Again, I think it's Dan's attempt to keep this canonical, make sure that's no longer true. So Cyborg Superman had set that up so that he could piggyback. He's a virus. Remember, he's a cyborg. He's basically a computer virus, can resurrect in a lot of different ways. Piggybacks Superman to take over Galactus's tech, but ends up working with the Fantastic Four against Galactus because Galactus has Superman as his herald, and that feels like no one's going to be able to stop him. Turns out it's relatively easy to stop him.
I don't even remember what turns Superman against Galactus again after he becomes the herald. That's where it gets especially...
We can talk more about that because, in fact, I really want to talk about Lois's role in this, non-role in this. Anyway, Superman turns against Galactus. Fantastic Four end up beating Cyborg Superman, but Superman and Reed working together are able to reconstruct Galactus's technology. It's an interesting premise because the idea is that Superman's strength is required to do this, and Reed couldn't do it without that, and Reed's brain is required to do this, and Superman couldn't do it without that. So you need the two of them. You're able to revert the tech where it will actually drain Galactus's life and he'll die if he doesn't stop. And so with that, he makes the agreement that he will stop consuming worlds with living beings on them, and he goes off, and the story's over.
What was, I think, interesting in just you walking us through that plot right there is how little you mentioned the Fantastic Four. You mentioned Superman a lot. Now, being that it was written by Dan Jurgens, who was the Superman architect, perhaps that's the reason why the Fantastic Four really doesn't really factor.
Well,
too
and
much
they're
into the
separated
plot.
for much of it. So Sue and Johnny and Ben are with Cyborg Superman trying to get to Reed, who is wherever Galactus is with Superman. So they're separated, and yeah, they don't have a lot to do. No one really has a lot to do. There's not a lot of action sequences in this book either.
No, and in part maybe because they kind of knew if you have Galactus and you have Superman, who now also has cosmic powers, the Human Torch is not going to have much of an effect on those two characters.
No, at one point I think they even tell Johnny, they're like, go keep Superman at bay for a few minutes, and you're sort of like, how's that going to work? That's not going to happen. So yeah, that's maybe also either a byproduct of or the result, the cause of it feeling like it jumps around.
There's a lot of Sue like, get into my force fields. That's their main strategy.
Yes. So, and then in terms of the arc, if there is one, and I love Dan Jurgens, and I like this book, and his art is just so quintessential 90s and looks great here. I wish she had a different inker maybe who would help it feel a little more detailed, but I still love the art. The arc, if you will, is Superman resisting Galactus. And at one point, Reed even says, like, think of Lois as a way to, like, get Superman, who's now has the power of a herald and is therefore, like, being consumed by the need to serve Galactus. He's trying to, like, be like, think of the ones you love, like, think of Lois. But then, like, that never comes up again. And also, you never see Lois Lois isn't in this book, which I guess you would have had to get her to the Marvel Universe, and Dan didn't want to do that. But it never even comes up again. I guess at that point, you just realize there's enough cracks in Galactus's hold on Superman. I don't know.
It rings back to Alicia's method with the Silver Surfer.
There's a lot in here that I think
other
takes
issues
from that. Yeah.
But where that kind of really works is that you have that coming from this human character. So she's really able to talk about, like, humanity as a human. Not that the Fantastic Four aren't humans, but yes, I think it would be more powerful if you actually had Lois in the story being the one to convince Superman that he needs to relinquish this cosmic power and
But you already have so many motivations here, because then even when Superman stops becoming the Herald, he wants to stop Galactus because he still at that point thinks Galactus destroyed Krypton.
Correct.
So he's, like, really motivated by not really revenge, more like, I will not let this happen again. And so it's like, I don't know, you don't need more motivation.
And I think the best idea in here is that idea that Galactus actually was involved in destroying Krypton, which makes so much sense, because if Krypton exploded or imploded or whatever we kind of think of happening to that planet, that Galactus was sucking the energy out. That is, I think, a brilliant idea, great way into the story, but it's somewhat undercut at the end where it's saying, like, oh, JK, this was actually all fake.
Well, because again,
the
I
whole
think
time.
there's a real attempt to have this story be canon, and yeah, I think that might take away. I mean, I wouldn't mind if it turned out to not be true. Why I think it falls apart is that I think the only reason Cyborg Superman is even in this is in order to have that story have been a lie. And you need a reason for it to have been a lie. If you take Cyborg Superman away, you can't quite figure out, well, why would Superman be under the belief that Galactus killed Krypton? So you need someone manipulating Superman, so you needed to put Cyborg Superman in. But I think that's where there's, like, no payoff. And I was even interested, and I was a huge 90s Superman fan, so I read these stories, but Dan Jurgens has said in interviews that the origin of Hank is actually inspired by the Fantastic Four, and there's that page in this, which I appreciate, where they're showing the similarities. Hank and his crew are on a spaceship, they get bombarded by cosmic rays, but in that story everyone dies, which is why Hank is sort of evil. And then that's never, like, there's no payoff other than that page where you're watching parallel origins.
Well, there's not even that kind of back and forth that you think, where Hank is kind of along for the ride, but, like, Ben doesn't really trust him. You get teeny bits of that, but, like, you want so much more repartee between, say, Ben and Hank, where he knows this character is going to stab them in the back at the end, and he's, like, keeping an eye on them. You don't really get too much of that in there.
But even there's so much more that I think could have been developed, in that you have this character who you're saying has a parallel origin, but everyone else died. That should mean he wants to be with the Fantastic Four. He should have enjoyed that experience.
That's interesting.
Or he's the evil version of Reed. He's like, well, what if the Four went out and everyone died around Reed? He would, like, be a villain, if you will. So there was so much more that could have been played with in terms of Cyborg Superman and the Fantastic Four, if you're going to put him in here. Frankly, again, I don't think he should be in here. But if you're going to put him in here, it was very underdeveloped.
I'm curious what would have happened too if they had also had Doom in the book. I'm curious, like, have Cyborg Superman and Doom, who's kind of a cyborg almost to himself. Like, have those two characters and have Hank have someone who he can reveal his plan to, maybe a partnership there. I wonder if there would be
That would have been too much. No, I think that would have been
too
way
much
too
for
much.
this, because yes, as we said, the book is so rushed in that feeling. But if it had more room to breathe, maybe then you could expand on those ideas.
Well, you're also the other issue again. I think it's an attempt to keep this so canonical and rule bound. Would mean that Cyborg Superman could only know about Galactus because Galactus is the omniversal character in this.
Mm-hmm.
He can't know about he can't know about anyone else.
Yeah.
He is only motivated by Galactus's power, and that makes sense within the logic of this story because this story is trying to tell us only Galactus can traverse these worlds, with the exception of now Superman and Fantastic Four knowing each other. So I think it's fun. It's not like a bad read, but it is not a great one either.
No. Yeah, I agree.
So I think we can move away from this world and talk a little bit more about what we might imagine.
Yes, it's time for our dessert course. It's Pondering Possibilities.
Will the future you describe be averted, averted, averted?
No, what are we talking about for our Pondering Possibilities?
Well, here's the really unusual thing. We often use our third segment to talk about characters on screen and what's to come. What's so wild is we have Superman and Fantastic Four coming out, I'd say, at two pretty big moments for both worlds. While DC, it is the start of their new universe. Marvel's been hurting, and I think needs a little reboot. So,
well, and DC too. I mean, like, people have kind of lost interest in that universe that was
well,
there.
No, it's new.
And, yeah,
this
it's
is
new. Yes,
this
yes.
is formally new.
What's it been?
So
about 25 years since the Batman movie.
Within 4 weeks of each other, they're coming out. And so it's really interesting. And so we have these two properties, and that's part of why we read this issue. So we can talk a little bit about them on screen. Galactus, we know, is in Fantastic Four, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And we'll imagine what's possible. But why don't you share some of the history of Galactus on screen before we talk about summer 2025?
Well, what's so interesting is that this is going to be really Galactus's first real, true on-screen non-animation appearance. In animated form, he was actually voiced, I thought this was so interesting, by Ted Cassidy, who you might know as Lurch from the original Addams Family series, way back in 1967. And then in the 90s series by Tony Jay, who was Megabyte on Reboot.
That's fun.
Mm-hmm. And then most people will know that in 2007,
we do.
for the Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer movie, that
The
Galactus,
Fox movie.
Yeah, Galactus appeared as a cosmic cloud with only these vague hints of his comic book form.
Yeah, it is totally ridiculous. But this summer, when Fantastic Four First Steps, I don't really like that subtitle, but Fantastic Four First Steps comes out, he'll be portrayed by Ralph Ineson, who was in the Harry Potter films, The Witch, Nosferatu, Game of Thrones. So, and we've seen already in the trailer, you see him. We watched the teaser. You and I generally don't watch these things. We did watch the Superman teaser and the Fantastic Four teaser. So sorry, we're going to be spoiling the teasers, but I think that's okay at this point. And you do see Galactus in that. So we know Galactus is in it. We know these two movies are coming out within a month of each other. Are we going to see Superman, Fantastic Four, The Infinite Destruction on screen?
No, we will not. No, I don't think so. But what I do think that we'll really see in both of them is kind of a return to this kind of a comic look and an embrace of the comics. You think that's true, that we're going to kind of go back to like the Stan and Jack in one case, we'll go back to kind of the origins of Superman in the other case?
Yeah, I don't think comic movies, well, Marvel comic movies haven't been like grim or washed out, which is what DC movies were for a long time and what Fox's Marvel universe was for a long time. But yes, I do think both of these are going to be an attempt to be bright and bombastic and very comic booky. I think they're going to be fighting. I think, while we're recording this next week, Captain America, the new Captain America comes out. That's going to be MCU-y.
Yeah.
I think Fantastic Four is going to be comic booky.
Yes.
I think it's going to be a slightly different version. It is a different world. We do know that from the trailer. I think it's going to also just be a different feel than the MCU. At the same time, of course, we know Superman being the first entry in DC's James Gunn DC universe post Creature Commandos is going to also set a different tone, be a different feel. So it is interesting that these two things are coming out.
Yeah,
right
and there
next
was
to
some
each
cases
other.
in Marvel, like Agatha All Along, which we enjoyed, but that was kind of using the basic character of Agatha as like a jumping off point. Like it wasn't necessarily taking the comics as a direct reference in many cases. Like they were kind of building their own world, while here it seems, even just from this teaser, that they're really taking their cues from the comic books themselves.
Yeah. So you don't think Galactus is going to be in Superman?
I don't think Galactus is going to be in Superman. I do love, Ralph Ineson, though, has one of the great voices, and for a character who's probably going to have lots of CG in how they do him.
I don't know. I hope they move away from that, and the Thing looks very practical in the trailer. And I know that, I don't follow discourse about anything today, but including especially perhaps Marvel movies, but I did see that there's some people who think Galactus should have been bigger and more cosmic of a being. But reading these first comics, it's like, no, he's standing on the roof of a building with Ben Grimm. Like, he is just supposed to be a giant, but he's not supposed to be some cosmic entity in the sky. Exactly. So I think we will see Ralph Ineson on screen wearing a costume a lot of the time. I don't think it's going to be exclusively digital, particularly because the legacy of this character is the joke Cloud from 2007.
Yes.
I mean, most of us who watched those movies, that is the absolutely most absurd part of them. And so they need to make sure they don't go anywhere near that, I think.
And we'll also have a new Silver Surfer character as well, which is going to be a little bit more of a departure because it's played by a female actor in this new movie.
Well, it's not Norrin Rad, I think, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
So I don't know, because again, I try not to follow to know. But
it is the actor, though, that was handpicked by Madonna to play herself in the Madonna biopic if it ever gets made. So
we have a Madonna Marvel DC crossover. I'm there.
She's the true devourer of worlds, that's for sure.
I know we've talked a lot since we've covered amalgams about the just insane possibility that one day there would be an on-screen crossover. I still think the chances are probably zero, but I don't know. There's also just a part of me that wonders. Not that I think Dan Jurgens' Infinite Destruction that we just covered is going to be the launching off point for it, because I just don't think there's enough in there to mine even. But I don't know. And Superman Spider-Man would probably actually make the most sense, since that's the first Marvel DC comic in the 1970s and they are kind of similar single heroes. But
I do think the cosmic element of the Fantastic Four and Superman do go really well
and
together.
we know that the Fantastic Four movie takes place in another universe. We know that the multiverse has been a controversial device in their MCU's narrative storytelling of the last 5+ years. So, and we also know that it's going to get a reckoning at some point, building to Secret Wars, whatever that ends up looking like. There will always be a tiny part of me that wonders, could it happen? And at this point, I think it couldn't happen because James Gunn is not going to taint the start of his universe by linking it to Marvel. But I just think both companies you have the top being exclusively profit driven. All they want are billions of dollars. These are corporate entities that are destroying our democracy that just want billions of dollars. But then they're giving a lot of power to really creative storytellers who want to tell stories. if these really creative storytellers found a story they could tell that would require lots of legal stuff, but get those companies billions of dollars, part of me's kind of maybe they're going to do it. Because
it would have to be the most profitable film of all time. I cannot see how it couldn't be. So even though it would cost so much money for the rights and the effects and what have you, like, you don't even need to spend marketing money. It's going to market it itself. And how could it not be the most successful film of all time?
Yeah. Well, they could mine Dan Jurgens' title, because I'll say one thing we didn't mention in our second segment. The title doesn't make any sense to me. Infinite Destruction.
Mm-hmm.
I guess what he's trying to do is riff on the Infinite Crisis aspect of DC and the fact that Galactus creates so much destruction, and we know that destruction is part of the first storyline of Marvel. They call this Doomsday, not destruction even. Anyway, so I guess that
Doomsday would have even made more sense. Although
Infinite Doomsday? No, people would have been confused.
Yeah.
So anyway, but Infinite Destruction, maybe that's post Secret Wars. That's the movie that gets announced. Marvel, DC, Infinite Destruction. You heard it here first.
Because if it's Infinite Doomsday, you have to have Doom and Doomsday. You have to have both of those characters.
Well, we already have a movie coming out called Avengers Doomsday.
Yeah, that's true. Oh, that's true. Oh, well, maybe
that's the DC crossover.
That's the DC crossover.
Oh, okay.
Doomsday in there.
So this summer, Superman, Fantastic Four do connect in worlds, and then Doomsday comes to join Robert Downey Jr. We've mapped it out. All right, so all in all, I think go visit this as the relic that it is, and we'll see on screen this summer. Obviously, there's going to be so much comparing of the two movies, both in terms of the box office they do and in terms of critical reviews. So we'll see who comes out the winner.
Post-credit sequence of Fantastic Four First Steps, Pedro Pascal just picks up this glowing green rock. You don't know. That's what I'm thinking.
And then the post credits for Superman, it's something with it's like they find the ultimate nullifier.
Yes, exactly.
There you go. Which movie do you think is winning, by the way, in the battle for the summer? Which one?
Gosh, that's a good question. I hadn't even thought of that.
I know my answer, so I'll go first. I think I have zero doubt Superman will win.
Historically, I'm going to say Superman, because also I think we've been so desperate for a Superman movie.
And a Superman in life. I think.
And a Superman in life. Yes, that's a good point.
I think when I was less excited about the Fantastic Four trailer because it didn't felt very inspired to me. I loved the aesthetic, but it didn't felt very inspired. Whereas Superman feels inspirational.
Well, and I think the thing you said too is oh yes, this is the start of James Gunn's new on-screen universe, but I think it's going to feel like a singular film.
Yes.
While the Fantastic Four is going to feel how is this going to play into
another
the next
chapter?
Step?
Yeah. The double-edged sword of the long storytelling of
I'll
the
be
MCU.
really curious to go back and see if that is how it all works out. If Superman is the bigger movie. I mean, I think they'll both be giant movies, though.
They will both be gigantic movies. If they're both good, they'll both make well over $1 billion. If they're not good, maybe one will struggle to keep up. But I do think Superman is the one we've all been waiting for. And I know, as someone who is more of a Marvel fan than a DC fan, the fact that I am more excited for Superman probably says a lot. So we'll return to this conversation this summer.
But until then, that's been a wrap. Dear watchers, thank you so much for listening.
I have been Cyborg Guido.
And I've been Rob.
Thrown in with no purpose.
Devourer of worlds. Now, devourer of dinner.
The reading list is in the show notes. Follow us online at Dear Watchers. Go to dearwatchers.com to review our previous episodes.
And leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. We'll be back soon with another trip through the multiverse.
In the words of Uatu, keep pondering the possibilities.